Hi Year 12s, and welcome to the second video in evolution and natural selection. This video is natural selection. We talked about the evolution side of this topic in the last PowerPoint. This one will be a little bit longer. So first off, what exactly is natural selection? Natural selection is just a process in which selection pressures, we talked about that last slide, remember, the ability to survive, result in changes in the gene pool of a population over time. As we can see over in this picture over here, so we've got selective pressures obviously taking place over here. This giraffe is taller. It's able to compete for these resources it can reach and survive, therefore survive, and then it passes on its genes. So it eats the leaves on the top. These two down here, too short, they can't reach. Therefore, the short ones, unfortunately, don't survive. They don't get the food. They couldn't compete for the resources. Where the two taller giraffes, or the one taller giraffe, has managed to survive and pass on its genes. So now we have a population of tall giraffes that can eat the trees. So the taller giraffe in the first diagram was able to survive against the selection pressures. It survived, it passed on its resources. The short ones did not. The population of giraffes changed to be tall. That's natural selection. Now, this idea was proposed by two different people at the same time. Ideally, we credit that to Charles Darwin mostly, but it was actually done at the same time as Alfred Wallace. Unfortunately, Charles Darwin published his book just a little bit earlier than Alfred Wallace, a matter of weeks. Therefore, Charles Darwin was credited to it, but both came to the same theory independently. One was just slower to publish it. Both of those scientists proposed that individuals with greater biological fitness are naturally selected to survive longer, and then their genes were passed on to the next generation. Individuals in a population with lower biological fitness, obviously less likely to survive those selection pressures, and they'll not be able to pass on their genes, as we can see with the short giraffes in that diagram. So genetic drift. Genetic drift is the change in frequency of alleles in the gene pool of a population to chance. So basically, population is changing the genetics due to chance. Genetic drift is the reason for increasing or decreasing the frequency of a certain allele in the gene pool of a population, and it occurs in all populations, but we see its effects more abundantly in smaller populations. So for example, over here we've got the different coloured frogs. We've got green, yellow, red. Genetic drift has reduced the effect of the yellow and the red, and only green frogs remain. We also have a process called genetic bottleneck. So that's when genetic drift occurs within a population and the size of that species is dramatically reduced. So that could be things like natural disasters, human intervention, anything. And the gene pool of the surviving population is a lot different than the population that was before the disaster. Obviously, that means that the frequency of some alleles is reduced or removed entirely, and the genetic diversity in the population is going to decrease as a result. So we can see that in the diagram over here. We're going to assume these are otters. We have lots of different colours of otters. There's been a poison in the water that the otters are living in, which has unfortunately killed off a majority of the population, leaving only brown and blue, and only a few of those otters survive. What happens is those surviving otters then move on and they reproduce, and when the population finally goes back to the numbers it used to be, we only have a population of blue and brown otters. The pink, the yellow, the green, different shade of blue, they're all gone, because the natural disaster or the human intervention reduced the alleles that were in the population. Therefore, overall, when the population's numbers returned, the genetic diversity was a lot lower. We also can sort of see that in something called the founder effect. So the founder effect is when a new population is started by just a few members of an existing population. The small size of that newly founded population is obviously going to result in changes in the allele frequency of that gene pool, and the new population will obviously have a lower genetic diversity and will not represent the original population. So although this is the bottleneck effect, you could imagine this slightly different. We've got this large population of otters over here. Then you've got the blue and the brown otters go off and start a new population elsewhere. Their population grows, and that population is not representative of the original population. Tasmanian devil. It's a good example of a species with low genetic diversity, so it's important that we have a look at this so that we can discuss examples of low genetic diversity. So Tasmanian devils lack genetic diversity in one region of their genome. That region of the genome codes for proteins that form the major histocompatibility complex, MHC. We've talked about that before. All the MHC does is identify disease-causing agents and initiates an immune response. We looked at that a lot in Year 11, if you can remember back to that. The lack of diversity in that section of their genome has led to the Tasmanian devils getting a contagious cancer called the devil facial tumour disease, DFTD. Current scientists are predicting that more than 50% of the population of Tasmanian devils suffer from that facial tumour disease. That's purely because of the lack of genetic diversity in that population. What DFTD does is leads to the growth of tumours. Those tumours prevent feeding, which causes starvation and death, and therefore we're seeing numbers of Tasmanian devil reduced and possibly eventually face extinction due to the low genetic diversity in their population. You can see a diagram of the tumour there. Obviously that's going to impact the devil's chance at feeding. Obviously, with low levels of genetic diversity, eventually it can lead to extinction. Tasmanian tiger is a good example of that. Species can only be classified extinct when the last individual dies. Therefore, the genome of that species cannot be passed on to a new generation. The extinction of a species is due to that species not being able to survive the selection pressures and the ecological niche that they stand in, and it's estimated that 99 of all species that have ever lived on Earth are now extinct due to that factor of the selection pressures. We also have endangered species. So species that are high risk of extinction are referred to as endangered species. Generally, those endangered species will have low genetic diversity, and that's what puts them at risk of extinction. Often with those endangered species, one single selection pressure could cause all those individuals to die in a short time and become extinct. There are currently 15,000 endangered species on Earth.